Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we are going to be diving into the realm of the paranormal. But before we do so, I'd like to extend a huge happy birthday to Liam. We are also very lucky to have the paranormal scholar join us for this edition. They've actually made a documentary, which I'd like to tell you about. Way back in 2007, Laura and her husband, Eric, the couple who run The Paranormal Scholar, decided to go out in search of proof of life after death. In Search of the Dead is the documentary that follows Laura's journey. The documentary is a genuine exploration of the paranormal and encourages people to look at the paranormal and the possibility of life after death seriously. The film includes interviews with renowned academics and experts, as well as live, unscripted paranormal investigations. Laura even visited Huaybacu Forest in Romania, which is said to be the most haunted forest on Earth. It is entirely self-funded, and watching it supports and promotes independent creators. If you are interested in watching In Search for the Dead, it is available to rent or buy via Vimeo. And with that being said, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I come from a military family, and as such, I lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to begin with. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years, at age 14. I have no friends. My home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land, with a river separating us from about 1 million acres of raw forest that had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a spooky forest, and I have tons of stories about what I saw in there that makes most horror movies look like a joke. Of note is the Bear Trap Forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But these are tales for another time. It was around late August. My parents had told me for many weeks now there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was just some kids trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times, and I'd heard it too, normally in the evening, of just a couple of voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure as hell didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon, and decided, you know what? I'm gonna see what's so amusing. So I ventured into the woods, and go maybe about 300 feet in an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I met one of them. I'm going to use their names, as it will give some context. The kid I met was called Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I said I had heard them for a while now, and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped, and insisted I follow him to his friend's project. So I follow the guy, and am taken into an area that is pretty clear-cut, in a dense path of woods. I knew this area, I hung out in the woods alone a lot and explored, and this was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age named Elvis, and another older kid by about 2 years called Louis. They said they were working on a treehouse/fort and wondered if I would be interested in helping. I of course said yes. I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. Now, I need to discuss these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion. Neon colors, one kid had shoulder pads, and was a mess. They wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say, new, like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, their clothes crisp as hell. I had just assumed they were hand-me-downs from their parents or something, as they stated that they were all friends, not brothers. So these kids were nice to me, and I mean really nice. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home life, but that isn't surprising where I lived. We used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails to make a pretty solid fort. Had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees, and we made a table to sit at. A lookout post in the biggest tree that we could find. The place was about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were all pretty proud. One day, we were sitting at the table, talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I'd never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of 2 schools in the town, and no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did, and wondered why he'd never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates, same people, and could barely agree on teachers. But whatever. These kids talked to me, and that was enough. So about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, on one of these days I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard and my parents always made way too much food. They became downright hostile. Not over the food, they just refused to cross the river, adamantly. Louis came up with the story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck, but I sure wasn't pushing the issue. I asked if they wanted something, and they said yes, and I brought back a pie that we could all eat. They apologized about getting angry, said they were just very superstitious, and I thought nothing more of it. We had a good rest of the day planning to invade the woods looking for some thick pine trees. Cut to about a week later. I had went to the fort and we did our thing, but today the kids looked haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beat down of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay. He said he just had flu. But they also looked wet, maybe greasy is a better word. They had sick hair. Their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like arse. I wasn't shocked. These kids wore the same clothes pretty much every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in town. We played around for an hour or so before they left, with Louis saying he would see me tomorrow, as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they'd smoked a pack a day. I had told my parents about these kids. They thought they were weird, but a kid with no friend just found 3, so don't ask questions. The nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never did see the flashlights again. So the next day I went back with a hatchet, a bag of nails in hand, as the plan was that we were going to give the lookout a roof. When I come to the fort, the place is wrecked. The walls had been torn down. The table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 pieces left to it. Most notably, everything was rotting, like it had been sitting there for decades, rotting. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had been our floor. Solid, half-tree growth. My only thought was, what the hell? And I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. So I waited for the kids to come. Next day, and the next day, and the day after that. I waited a week but never did see those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they had never shown me or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked me why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore. I told them what was happening, and they dismissed it and just insisted that they probably didn't want to be my friend, that I didn't need them. I was sad for a good while after that. Cut to today. I'm 29, and telling my wife about these kids I used to hang out with. And this time, we made a call forward. I explain how they look, how they acted, and it's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and said, "You hang out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but not the kids. They heard them, and they heard about them, but no one had ever laid an eye on them other than me. There were never any records I could find about them. No one else in the school they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house or came to mind despite my insistence. My wife said it was some spooky stuff, and that I should probably share it with all of you. What do you guys think?
About a year ago, I had some strange goings-on in my apartment. For context, my apartment is literally an underhanded stone's throw away from a bar. Whilst it wasn't common, usually you could bet that at least once a year some drunk guy would try to get into my apartment. They had never actually succeeded. Most of the time it's just a twist on the doorknob in the middle of the night and nothing else. But because of this, my then girlfriend insisted that I keep a pistol by the bed just in case, which I did. We ended up splitting up, but the pistol stayed by my bed just because I'm the kind of guy where if something stays in a certain spot for long enough, that spot becomes its home and that's where it belongs. Anyway, one night I had been drinking at said bar, which was really convenient because all I had to do was walk 15 yards to get back home. Nothing particularly exciting had happened. I climbed into bed around 11:30 and went to sleep. This is where it gets weird. I kind of wake up, barely able to open my eyes and not able to move, but I can see a little out of my barely opened eyes and I can hear. I now know that this had to be some sort of sleep paralysis, I assume, but I had never experienced it before or after this event. Paralyzed in my bed, I see through my barely opened eyes a weird arm creeping up over the side of my bed. I have a particularly tall bed, like 3.5 feet up off the ground, which is more than enough room for somebody to be under there. This arm lay its hand down around my ankle and started sliding up my leg. I could feel it vividly the whole way up. It stopped around 4 inches from where my thigh and hip met, and then squeezed hard. Then I heard in a super raspy man's voice, "What are you gonna do? Just let me kill you." The hand let go and sucked back underneath the bed, and then I had instant control of my body again. I snatched up my pistol on the nightstand and threw on the lights in my bedroom. I checked under the bed, but nothing. I checked in the closet, nothing. I checked the whole apartment, which isn't hard to do seeing as it's 1 bedroom, a bathroom and a living room kitchen area, but still nothing. I checked the door, still locked from the inside. I even started checking stupid places like in the refrigerator, the cabinets, the water heater closet. There had to be someone in there with me, I glanced at the time on my oven. It was around 3:30ish, so I figured it was just a really vivid bad dream and I should try to get some more sleep. Naturally, I was still pretty cranked up over the encounter, so I decided to browse Reddit until my nerves were calm enough to sleep. The weirdness did not end there. After about 10 minutes of messing around on my phone, I heard a noise from the kitchen which was directly out the door from my bedroom, with the door wide open. A clop. Like the kind of noise a horse makes when going down a brick road, but just one, singular clop. I thought, okay, weird, but maybe it's just a dish settling in the sink or something. But no, it happened again a few seconds later, and a few seconds after that, and so on and so forth. Some were relatively quiet, some were just downright loud. After about a minute of just clippity-clopping away, this repulsive stench takes over my room, like a rotten egg, sulphury smell. I set my phone down, snatched my pistol back up, and sat with my back against the wall. I just sat and waited. It finally stopped after what seemed like forever. The clopping and the smell just went away. I grabbed my watch off the nightstand and checked the time. It was a little after 4. I eventually fell asleep for a couple of hours. The next day, all I could think about were the events of the night before. I was uneasy to be in my apartment. When it came time to go back home, I didn't know how I was going to do another night like the last one. Then I had one of my best ideas to date. The demons can't mess with me if I drink so much I pass out. Genius. So I went about doing just that, and wouldn't you know, it worked. I woke up the next morning super hungover, but without incident, until I got up to move around. I went to turn on my bedroom lights. They come on for about half a second, and then all 3 of them burned out. This became a common theme all that morning. Turn them on, and they burn out. Out of all the light bulbs in my apartment, only 3 survived. I had one in the bathroom, one in the living room, and one in the closet of my bedroom. That was it. On top of this, there was also a lot of randomly dead battery-operated devices that had died at some point between the day before and the day that was now. I was going to visit my parents that day, and it was a warmish day, so I decided I was going to ride my motorcycle. I went to start that. The battery is dead. Okay, fine, I'll take my truck. Its battery is also dead. I go and knock on my neighbor's door to see if he can give me a jump so I could go on my way. His truck's battery is also dead. I ended up walking 30 minutes one way to buy a battery charger from the AutoZone, but that's neither here nor there. I finally got on the road and went to visit my parents, which was all fine and dandy. That night, I went on to visit one of my friends from my hometown. It was just me, him, and his girlfriend there talking when I decided to tell them about the events that had been happening to me as of late. I knew his girlfriend was into creepy things, ghost stories and such, but I had no idea how into it she was. Flash forward 30 minutes, and I'm getting rubbed head to toe with an egg to find out if I had bad juju in me. She cracked it in a glass of water and looked at it and told me that I had malevolent evils within me or something along that line, but that I also had something fighting it for me already. Now let me tell you, that is not something that is nice to hear whether you believe it or not. She gave me some advice on what to do, which mostly involved burning one of those Jesus candles you find at the dollar store until it ran out of wax, preferably only lighting it once and letting it burn from there. Also, she was very adamant that I only light it with a match, not a lighter. Well, I went back home and picked me a box of matches and a Jesus candle and went to work. And work it was. I could not get that candle to stay lit to save my life. Within the first 10 minutes of burning the candle, I had to relight it at least 8 times. And every time you relit it, you were supposed to say the prayer on the back, so I did. Now I'm not religious whatsoever, so I felt mighty awkward doing this, but I powered through. After the fury that was the first 10 minutes of lighting the candle, it burned nicely and never went out until all the wax was gone. No problems since then. Also, a fun side note, I now buy those Jesus candles in bulk and always have one burning. Not that I'm afraid whatever it was will come back for me, but because they're pretty and I like to wake up in the middle of the night and see it still going strong in the kitchen from my bed. Sort of a nightlight thing, I suppose. Now, with all that being said, it could have just been a bad dream, my imagination, or a series of coincidences. I'm pretty well versed in spookiness. I love to watch all those types of videos on YouTube, and it is completely possible that my brain just conjured up some information I had stored in there and used it in a nightmare and then filled in the rest. I suppose I will never know. I had my sleep molested by a demon, nostrils assaulted with a sulphurous stench. Most of the light bulbs in my apartment burn out, had a hoodoo voodoo woman rub an egg all over my body to tell me there was something after me, fought to keep a Jesus candle lit, and lived happily ever after. And the kicker is, it all could have just been in my head and random coincidences.
When I was growing up in the 60s on Long Island, I adored my Aunt Elizabeth. She's my dad's baby sister, 12 years younger and 17 years older than me. She was a flight attendant for a major carrier and lived in an apartment in the city with a classic Italian beauty, petite with beautiful olive skin, green eyes, and jet black hair. She doted on me, and I loved the pictures and gifts that she'd bring for me from other parts of the country, and sometimes even Europe. When I got older, my parents would let me go visit her apartment, where she and her equally gorgeous and glamorous friends would smoke cigarettes, drink cocktails, and play records and talk about glamorous and adult things together. And I would feel sophisticated and cool merely by being in the room. One day, when she was 30, she was called in sick to work. Thinking she had the flu, it turned out to be meningitis, and she was dead within 2 days. What followed were the saddest events of my childhood. One of 3 times I saw my father cry, big, racking sobs, was as he was dressing for the wake. I remember Aunt Elizabeth laid out at the wake, wearing her flight attendant uniform, still beautiful. I remember how soft and lovely the cream-colored satin lining her casket felt. So many people came to her funeral that people just spilled out on the sidewalk next to our little suburban Catholic church. Sunday dinners with my grandparents and aunts and uncles never felt the same. Ironically, this niece of a flight attendant from the golden age of air has always been terrified of air travel. I used to travel quite frequently for work, and on some long-haul flights I would be unable to cope without the help from a whole bottle of red wine and Ambien. A few months ago, I decided I want to drop that. It's not exactly healthy. So on my first flight across the country in a while, I took 10 milligrams of melatonin, sat in my seat anxiously, and tried to fall asleep. Eventually I did, and what followed were terrifying dreams. Of course, it would take place on the same flight, and of course the cabin pressure would drop, and of course the plane would be plummeting, and I was about to die crashing into a cornfield. As everyone panicked and screamed, I saw a flight attendant walking down the aisle to my seat, and it was my Aunt Elizabeth. She was walking calmly and intently with a little sly smile on her face, as if I were an old friend of hers who she hadn't seen in a long time. She was wearing the same flight attendant uniform she was buried in, but her legs and feet were bare. She came, looked at me, took my left hand in hers and said, "It'll be okay, honey. It really will. Things can look bad, and sometimes it gets a little turbulent, but the pilot will right it." And then said, "How are you?" I sputtered out the first thing that came to mind if asked, "What have you done with your life since age 13? I think I mentioned where I went to school, and something about my first job, something about cell phones and how much she would have loved them. I said my dad had passed, but my mum and sister were doing fine. I talked about how ridiculous rents were in the city and about the changes that had happened to our hometown. As I was babbling, I noticed the plane returning to normal, the pressure coming back, people calming down, and the dream ended shortly before everything returned to normality. Aunt Elizabeth's hand on my shoulder. I woke up 30 minutes before landing. I was so stunned by this dream. I hadn't really thought about Aunt Elizabeth or about her in detail for years. I had a few minutes, so I called my mother and told her what happened. I mentioned that I thought it strange that in the dream she was barefoot while working on the plane, and my mother paused and said, "Elizabeth was buried barefoot." Apparently, it's custom in the little corner of Sicily that my father's family comes from for women to be buried barefoot when laid to rest, and they'd adhere to it when burying Aunt Elizabeth and my grandmother many years later. I would not have known, as the lower lid of her casket was closed during the wake. I'm not even religious, but that made me truly believe that my Aunt Elizabeth came to visit me and comfort me during a time of stress and fear, or something like her, a piece of her. It was wonderful and moving to realize this, like a warm blanket around me. I suddenly recalled memories of my aunt that I didn't even know I had. I was in tears in an airport bathroom. I've been through a lot in my life. Some moves, unemployment, 2 divorces, losing a house, and getting one back. Friends and family dying. But for a few moments in a dream I got to see someone who I loved and who loved me when I was a little girl, excited for the big world ahead of her. I love you, Aunt Elizabeth. Visit again, anytime.
My family moved to a small town just south of the Malaysian capital, Kuala Lumpur, when I was in primary school. The first house we lived in was an old colonial government staff quarters behind the district hospital. Like many old houses, this one was reported to be haunted. It was not a big house. There were 3 rooms with 2 toilets and a rather large kitchen, but it had in it an interesting feature that is only found in colonial houses. It had an inside courtyard. I was about 6 years old when we moved into that house. Perhaps because I was too young, I do not remember experiencing anything strange or weird when we lived there, but other members of my family did. The most commonly seen occurrence was the lady with the candle. The first time it happened was when the neighbor from across the road asked my mother if we had a power outage the night before. This puzzled my mother because we had gone to visit my aunt and uncle in the capital that night. The neighbor said that when she went out to get something from her car, she had seen a woman walking in our house holding a lit candle. This happened several times after that. My family, however, never saw her. At the foot of the hill from our house, there was a playground. The playground itself was not noteworthy, but several of our neighbors said that they had seen a small boy of perhaps 4 or 5 years old walking with an older girl of around 12. They said that they looked like brother and sister. The strange thing was they could only be seen at dusk and if it was either drizzling or raining. They said that they saw the duo walking on the pavement beside the park. When they looked away and turned back, the 2 would be gone. One of our neighbors was an older couple whose house was nearest to the playground. One day when they came to visit us along with a few other neighbors, someone brought up the 2 children. The old lady then told them who they were. Apparently the 2 children used to live in a house just around the corner from the playground. They played at the playground often, and each time the elder sister would take the boy and they would play on the swings. One day, as it was nearing dusk and it started to drizzle, the girl packed up her brother and started for home before the rain could get heavier. Unfortunately, as they were walking on the pavement, a speeding car lost control and ploughed straight into them. They died upon impact. The driver didn't stop. He just sped off, leaving the bloodied and broken bodies of the two children where they fell. She did not know if they were dead or alive immediately after the murder, but her husband, who was coming back from work at the time, saw the children. He immediately sped to the hospital, which was only a few hundred meters away, and informed them of the two children. The ambulance was there in a matter of minutes, but they could not do anything. She said that the parents were devastated. The mother later had to be taken to the psychiatric hospital, and shortly after that, they moved away.
Currently, my boys are 8 and 6. At the time, they were 4 and 2. We had been living in a place for about 5 to 6 months, and my oldest, who isn't firing on any cylinders to be honest, kept walking to the corner, looking up, and talking. He was still doing a lot of babbling until he was almost 6, and then after a few times he walked over, grabbed his younger brother by the hand, walked him to the corner, and he also looked up, started talking, and they were both smiling and giggling, like an adult was interacting with them. After my youngest's 3rd trip over, I asked, "What in the world are you two doing?" thinking it was some kind of game. My oldest giggled and said, "I'm talking to Grandpa." I'm confused. "Baby, your grandpa lives in Nebraska. He's very far away." My child looks at me and replies, "No, Mummy, it's your grandpa." As I said, my oldest was still doing a lot of babbling, so for him to suddenly speak so clearly and in a complete coherent thought was very unnerving. I look at the corner. Both my boys are talking and showing toys up to the corner. I watch for a few minutes. This all happened over a grand total of about half hour. "Babies, come watch your movie so Mum can finish dinner," because little ones have zero logic. The younger one waddles over and sits down. The eldest picks up the toys that had accumulated in the corner and put them away and sat next to his brother. I start dinner and I keep looking at the corner. Shot in the dark. "Thanks, Grandpa." The door in the corner fell open like someone walked through it, and there was a heightened feeling in the room afterwards. That night, I had a dream of my childhood home, and on the path back to the woods there was a small building, granite like a mausoleum, but was little more than an awning. One wall that held a door, 4 pillars, and a bench swing. I walked to it and lit an incense and sat on the swing and started rocking, staring at the ground. Then, there they were, those old ratty sneakers. My grandpa was sitting next to me with that smile, sitting on the swing. I just started talking, mostly about the boys. I told him I missed him so much that I named my oldest after him. He just sat and listened with that smile on his face. After a while, we both stood up. I hugged him and told him I hadn't told him everything yet. Then my name was called from somewhere. I looked around, didn't see anyone, but I looked back and he was gone. I yanked the door open, and it went into this vertical shaft, endless in both directions, completely lined with doors. I woke up crying amidst a panic attack. My grandfather died in about 2005, my grandmother in 2008, and my son was born in 2010, just 1 week shy of my grandfather's birthday, which happened to be the day the doctor scheduled me to originally be induced. I was 10 or 11 years old and was sleeping in my grandma's guest bedroom. Next to the bed was an antique easy chair. When I woke up next morning, I looked over towards the chair, and sitting there was a little girl. She had dark hair that was done up in pigtails and tied by a blue ribbon. She wore an old-fashioned dress of the early 1900s, and initially, I was startled to see her. I was even more startled to see through her. She just looked at me and smiled. She did a small wave and mouthed the words, "Hello." I said hello back, and she faded. That was my first experience with a ghost. Months later, it was Easter Sunday. My sister and I were staying the night at my grandma's house so that we could receive our Easter basket and hunt for eggs. I woke up early to get a peek at the Easter baskets. I slipped out of bed and walked quietly to the living room. The early morning sunshine was brightly streaming through the windows and into the living room. Sitting on the couch was the little girl. I smiled and waved hello again, and she smiled and waved back. I told her it was great to see her, and she emphatically nodded that it was good to see me too. My grandma must have heard me talking to someone because she woke up and told me to go back to bed, that it was still far too early to hunt for eggs. I looked at my grandmother and then back at the couch. The little girl was gone. That was the last time I saw the little girl with the blue ribbons in her hair. My grandma moved from there shortly after into a new place. However, my friend Melissa ended up moving into where my grandma lived, and she claims to have seen the little girl with the ribbons in her hair. During the same period, my mum, sister and I were all living in a trailer on my great-uncle Wilbert's property, a large cattle ranch. We were staying there while my dad was stationed in Okinawa, Japan. On this property in the mid-80s, Uncle Wilbert had built a 2-story building. Everybody called it the tower. Windows faced each direction on the top floor. The largest one faced towards Highway 99. Wilbert believed that you could learn much from observing the 99. In the evening, he would often go up to the tower, watch TV, and keep watch over the cattle. In the lower portion of the tower is where my family kept our clothes and food. One night, Mum had instructed my sister and I to go to the bottom of the tower to pick out our breakfast for the next morning. Trisha was in the middle of doing something, so I offered to grab breakfast for her. I entered the bottom floor of the tower, chose a handful of Pop-Tarts, and above me I could hear the TV. So I assumed Uncle Wilbert was up in the tower. I stepped out the bottom half and looked up towards the large window to see if Wilbert was there. The TV was, but Wilbert wasn't in the tower. Instead, there was a family. A mother, father, little girl and boy. I thought that it was strange they were up there as Wilbert hardly ever had visitors. Another strange thing was that they weren't watching a TV. Instead, they were sitting on the couch and staring out the window towards Highway 99. They didn't move. They were all sitting with perfect posture and hands settled on their laps. Even though I thought it was unusual, I just returned to the trailer and didn't say anything to my mum about it. The next day, I asked Uncle Wilbert who his guests were, and he looks at me with a confused look on his face. He hadn't had any guests last night, and nobody by that description. Who were those people? A few months after that, I had gone down to the bottom of the tower again to grab my breakfast for the next morning. I went in, grabbed some oatmeal, and as I was closing the door behind me, I looked up to the landing that leads to the door on the top floor. Looking over the landing was a woman dressed in a white flowing dress. She herself was as white as the dress, and the woman's hair and dress blew in a non-existent wind. She looked down at me. She smiled, did a slow, long, graceful wave, and despite this friendly gesture, I was terrified. She reminded me of the depiction of banshees that I had seen in movies. I ran back to the trailer and told my mum about what I'd seen. She exited the trailer and took the stairs up to the top of the tower. She opened the tower door and no one was there. We knew the lady couldn't have gotten down the stairs because the windows on the trailer faced directly towards the stairway, and we didn't see anyone come down. Most of the friends of the family know that the tower is haunted. I believe that it sits on some kind of vortex. Though my family no longer lives on the property, I still see spirits from time to time. I call them my visitors. I don't try and communicate with them, nor they me. They just appear, and as quickly as they come, they are gone.
I live in a farmhouse in Maine that's over 100 years old. I've had lots of paranormal experiences here. When we moved in, we had to clean out all the belongings of the previous resident. About a month after we moved in, our elderly neighbor told us, without us asking, that the previous residents had left in the middle of the night and never came back. They even left their pets. The first thing I remember is that I always felt as if I were being watched, especially on the stairs or upstairs in the hallway. My children, I have 3, have always stared at things I couldn't see and woken up at night screaming. They would point at my bedroom closet when they did this. Since my oldest son was born, I would hear things over the audio baby monitor. It was a child talking or singing. My child was way too young to be doing this. I also had some experiences with the video monitor I've got. I have since stopped using it. About a year after we moved in, my kids received a balloon at their birthday party. It was an average helium balloon that said happy birthday on it. It had been deflated and on the floor for about a week when this took place. My ex and I were upstairs in the hallway when the balloon came floating out of my daughter's bedroom, about 4 feet off the floor. I thought it was weird because it hadn't floated for about a week. My ex walked to the end of the hallway to another bedroom and the balloon followed. He walked back to the middle of the hallway, it followed. Then he went into our bedroom, the balloon followed him. He walked around the bed, it followed. Then it followed him back into the hallway. I used to have a video of this occurrence, but it's on an old cell phone and I can't find it now. Another experience happened when my oldest daughter was around 2 years old and would wake up around 2 or 3 a.m. every night. I would hear her in her room at the end of the hall by the stairs, talking, laughing, and overall having a great time. When I went and asked her who she was talking to, she replied, "The captain." I would lay down in her bed with her to get her back to sleep, and I would hear what sounded like fabric swishing and footsteps around her bed. They were very distinct. About 8 years later, a friend of mine was sitting in his truck in the driveway. I was standing outside talking to him. He had his dog in the truck, and the dog kept barking and growling at my upstairs window. Finally, my friend said, "He sees the captain." I had pretty much forgotten about my daughter playing with the captain as it had been years since she had done it, so I asked him what he was talking about. He said that a friend of his had lived in my house many years ago. They had strange experiences there and attributed them to someone they called the captain. I had never told him about what my daughter had said and done. When my daughter was born, I still had an infant son, and I was nursing her, so we slept downstairs on the couch to avoid waking him up in the middle of the night. I'm a smoker, so I would go outside and smoke when she fell asleep after her nighttime feedings, before I went back to bed. I would often see little blonde children running in front of the door while I was outside. They looked to be about 2 to 4 years old, as all I could see was their little blonde heads as they ran by. My kids all have dark hair. One night, while going outside, I saw in the reflection from the glass window of the door a man standing behind me. He was tall and thin, and I can only describe him as looking like Walt Disney. He was just standing behind me, not moving as far as I could tell by his reflection. I was scared when I saw him, but by the time I was finished, I had calmed myself down enough to go back inside. There was a night that I was home alone. My mother had taken the kids for the night and I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard loud boots stomping on the floor directly above me. 5 distinct footsteps. Later that night, when my ex had come home and we had fallen asleep in bed, I heard a huge bang right above my head in the attic. I would describe it as someone dropping a bowling ball, but there was no one there, no pets at the time, and the attic door was closed and locked. One night I came downstairs to the kitchen to get a drink. As I was approaching the top of the stairs, I saw a shadow that was darker than the darkness. I started to run down the stairs, thinking there was an intruder in my house. At the same time, the shadow rushed up the stairs, and we met about 1/3 of the way down. As we collided, I felt an electric shock go through me. It wasn't an actual person.
Me and my sister stayed at my mum's a couple of years ago, and we both had to stay in my sister's old room that she always hated. She said spooky stuff used to happen all the time when she was younger, but we just kind of shrugged it off as an overactive imagination. It's about 2 a.m, and we've pretty much talked about anything and everything when I ask if she can turn the light off, since I'm pretty tired and want to sleep. And I kid you not, about 3 minutes after the lights are off, we hear this super low rough growling, like the noise the Grudge makes before she attacks. I asked like a 10-year-old, "Was that you?" "No, was that you? Turn the lights on, turn the lights on." Of course, the lamp falls off the dresser as she's trying to turn it on, while we're both in full panic mode. "See, I told you the room is freaky." I laughed nervously, but we slept with the light on that night. Can't even put it down to us being kids. We were in our early 20s. I had other freaky things happen in that room, but I just put it down to lucid dreams.
This one is always hard for me to talk about, not because of the subject itself, but because it's so difficult to articulate what happened. 6 years ago, my best friend and I were driving in the car when I was suddenly overcome by an unusual feeling. Again, it's very hard to describe, but I had never felt anything like it before or since, but the closest phrase to use might be surreal dread. It felt like we were watching ourselves in a horror film, if that makes any sense. Nothing felt the way it had only minutes before. It was like we had driven into an alternate reality, where everything was just a little bit off and nothing seemed right. A few minutes after I realized this, my friend asked, "Do you feel that?" It made the hairs on my neck stand up. I asked him to describe what he was feeling, and he put it like this: "It's not depression, it's not panic, it's not paranoia, I'm not hallucinating. I don't know what's wrong, but something clearly is. I started to feel it just a few days ago." This obviously freaked us out a lot, and we didn't know how to handle it. There was no way of telling other people how we felt. We hoped it would pass, whatever it was, but it didn't. Over the next few days, the weird feeling grew stronger and stronger for both of us. And then, out of the blue, a third friend called and confided in us, revealing that he had been feeling the exact same thing. We started referring to it as the ominous presence. We found that if we ignored it, the feeling still seemed to be there. If we talked about it, it seemed to grow stronger and stronger, to the point at which it made us feel physically ill. That was a horrible summer. Eventually, we gathered together late at night and decided to perform a ceremony to banish the thing, whatever it was. None of us were strong believers in the supernatural, but it seemed like the only way to handle our situation. We wondered if it might be a thought form or tulpa or dweller on the threshold, something that our minds created that grew stronger and stronger the more we believed in it. After our ceremony, it seemed to go away for a long time. but there's always a lingering fear that it's still with me. Last week, my friend killed himself unexpectedly, which makes this memory all the more confusing and upsetting. I still don't know if the ominous presence was supernatural, but it's clear from the way things turned out that the mind is a very complicated thing.
I've had plenty of weird and unexplainable experiences, but this one is the only one that I find difficult putting into words. When I was around 6, I remember whenever I found myself alone, I used to see a man in my house always behind me, in corners, behind the sofa I was sitting on. This happened for years. This thing was very human-like. There was not a faded or blurred line, and this thing would always be wearing the same clothes when I saw it. I would catch glimpses of it, and as soon as I turned around it would be gone, as if nothing were there. I remember as a child it didn't scare me as much as it should have, but I was always super cautious and uneasy. It never made me run crying to my parents though. What is weird is that at this time I recognized the man. In my head the man was my uncle/family friend who I thought was very much alive. So everything I saw, I put down to my imagination. A few years go by and I kept on seeing this. What I realized was that I never saw this man in real life. There were no pictures of him, never any meeting with families. So how could I possibly have this feeling that I knew him? How could my brain invent this character and backstory for him? I was asking around for this unidentified uncle, and it seems he never really existed. I looked at the family photos of the family who I thought were his, and nothing. Unfortunately, my father passed a few years ago, and since I've been trying to find photos of him, I came across a photo of my dad and his dad, my grandfather, who I'd never met. And the man I used to see looks a lot like him, but not an 100% match. My memories have obviously faded because of how long ago it was, but I know it's only in resemblance and not who I used to see as a child.
Thank you for listening to my narrations, and thank you to Mortis for allowing me to come and narrate on his channel. It's always a wonderful experience. If you do enjoy stories such as these and you absolutely love the paranormal, then I would be extremely grateful if you could take the time to visit my channel, The Paranormal Scholar, and watch the trailer to my recent debut full-feature documentary on the subject of life after death, called In Search of the Dead. The documentary is over 2 hours long and has taken over 2 years for my husband Eric and I to make. It is the perfect way to spend an evening if you enjoy the paranormal. So please go take a look and watch the trailer and see if it would be something that you would be interested in. Thank you again, Mortis, for inviting me to your channel. I truly hope you enjoyed my narrations.